I never imagined the woman I welcomed into my home, the wife of my only son, would look me in the eye and try to kill me for my life savings. She thought I was a weak old man, too sick to notice her switching my antibiotics for poison right there in the pharmacy. But she didn't count on the one man in town who knew my history, the pharmacist, who saw the whole thing on camera. When I finally confronted her with the truth, the look on her face wasn't remorse. It was the terror of getting caught. And believe me, she was about to pay for everything. Before we get into it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments what your favorite comfort food is when you're feeling sick. The sickness came on like a thief in the night. One minute I was fine, enjoying the crisp Cleveland autumn air from my porch, and the next a deep, predatory chill had sunk its claws into my bones. It wasn't the kind of cold you can fix with a sweater. It was an internal freeze, a signal from deep inside that my body was losing a war I didn't even know it was fighting. By morning, every joint in my 8-year-old body screamed in protest. My throat felt like I'd swallowed a fistful of sandpaper, and a fever was cooking me from the inside out, leaving my skin clammy and my thoughts thick as mud. I gripped the doorframe of my own living room, the wood I'd stained myself 20 years ago, feeling like the only solid thing in the universe. Sprawled out on my leather couch, the one I'd saved up 18 months to buy after I retired from the Ford plant, were my son, Kevin, and his wife, Jessica. They were completely absorbed, their faces lit by the flickering blue light of the television. Some reality show about rich people screaming at each other on a yacht was apparently more important than the world ending. My world, anyway. They'd been living with me for 3 years, just until we get back on our feet, a temporary situation that had somehow become as permanent and immovable as the Ohio winter. "Kevin," I rasped. My voice sounded alien, like gravel being dragged across concrete. I need to get to the pharmacy. My temperature's pushing 103. He didn't even flinch. He just shifted his weight, pulling one of my throw pillows, a gift from my late wife, more comfortably behind his head. "In a minute, Dad." It's the season finale. The casualness of it, the utter lack of concern, hit me harder than the fever. Here I was, standing in the home I'd poured 40 years of sweat and busted knuckles into, feeling like a ghost. I could feel the dampness of my own sweat soaking through my pajamas, each breath a rattling battle in my chest. The volume on the TV seemed to mock me, some celebrity complaining about her champagne being too warm while my son couldn't spare 5 minutes for his father, who felt like he was burning alive. "Please," I tried again, hating the weakness I heard in my own voice. "Dave's pharmacy closes in less than an hour." That's when Jessica finally turned her head. Her eyes, reflecting the screen's artificial light, were flat and bored. She performed a theatrical eye roll, a gesture of pure, unadulterated annoyance, before turning back to the screen. "Art, for God's sake, it's just the flu. Take a Tylenol or something, you're not dying." The words hung in the air, colder and sharper than the November wind outside. "You're not dying." Here I was, shaking so badly I could barely stand, probably looking like death warmed over. And this woman, the woman I'd opened my home to, the woman whose car repairs I'd paid for just last month, couldn't be bothered to fake an ounce of compassion. Kevin just grunted in agreement, his attention already back on the yacht drama. I looked down at my hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin permanently stained with the faint ghost of grease and oil no amount of soap could ever wash away. These were the hands that had paid for Kevin's college degree, the one hanging on a wall in their bedroom upstairs, gathering dust. The hands that had given them a down payment for their wedding. The hands that had built this life they were so casually enjoying while I fell apart in front of them. And in that moment, I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that to them, I wasn't a father or a benefactor. I was just part of the furniture. And right now, I was the squeaky, inconvenient part they wished would just be quiet. That phrase, "You're not dying," echoed in the cavern of my skull, cutting through the fog of the fever. It wasn't just dismissive, it was a judgment. It was the sound of someone inconvenienced by my very existence. The cold clarity I'd felt a moment ago began to boil, the heat rising from my gut until it felt hotter than the flu itself. 40 years of 5 a.m. Alarms, of crawling under rusted-out trucks in the dead of a Cleveland winter, of hands so chapped and bleeding I could barely hold a fork. All of it, every sacrifice, was just an annoyance to them. The ghost of my past self, the young man who worked double shifts to make sure his boy had a better life, stood beside me, and he was furious. "This couch," I said, my voice low and shaking, not from weakness this time, but from a rage so pure it burned my throat. "This television, the food in the refrigerator, the roof over your head. Who do you think pays for all that?" Kevin's head finally snapped toward me, his face twisting not with concern but with irritation. "Dad, don't start with the guilt trips. Not right now." "Guilt trips?" The words erupted from my chest, hot and bitter. I took a step into the room, my legs unsteady, but my anger holding me up like a steel frame. "You've been living in my house for 3 years. 3 years! You haven't paid a dime toward the mortgage, the utilities, or the groceries. You haven't even looked for a job in 6 months, Kevin." I stared at my son, this man I'd raised, this stranger who had taken my generosity, and twisted it into an expectation. I saw not a hint of shame in his eyes, only the petulant defensiveness of a child who's been told to clean his room. "The job market is tough, Dad," he mumbled, looking away. "It's not like it was in your day. You wouldn't understand." "Wouldn't understand?" A humorless, rattling laugh escaped my lips. 40 years I worked at that plant. 40 years of breathing in paint fumes and burning my hands on hot engines. 40 years of coming home so tired I'd fall asleep at the dinner table. And you have the nerve to tell me I wouldn't understand hard work? The fever was making me reckless, stripping away the polite filter I usually kept between my thoughts and my words. The dam had burst. I didn't do all that so my son could melt into a couch and watch reality television while his father begs for a ride to the pharmacy. Jessica finally paused the TV, sighing with the dramatic weight of someone being asked to solve a global crisis. "Can we please not do this right now, Art? We've been waiting all week to see how this season ends." Her casual indifference was the final matchstick on the gasoline. My life's work, my sacrifices, my very health. It was all just an intermission in their evening's entertainment. Why should you care anyway? The words spilled out, laced with a venom I hadn't realized I was holding. "You're just waiting for me to kick the bucket so you can have it all. You think I don't see the way you look at this place?" That got their attention. Kevin's eyebrows shot up, and even Jess leaned forward slightly, her boredom finally pierced by the mention of inheritance. But I was just getting started, the fever burning away all caution. "You think this is all just free for the taking? This house you treat like a hotel? It's worth over $350,000. The number hung in the air, heavy and solid. I saw a flicker in Jessica's eyes, a quick, sharp glint of calculation that hadn't been there a second ago. "And that's before we even talk about the savings," I pushed on, my voice cracking. "The money I put away instead of taking vacations. The money I saved by driving the same truck for 20 years. $250,000 tucked away. All of it, everything I worked for." I said it. I put the number on my life's work. A grand total of $600,000. The silence that followed was different from before. It was absolute. The dramatic music from the paused television was gone. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I watched as the meaning of those numbers landed on them, not as a testament to my hard work, but as a lottery ticket they were holding. Jessica's face, which had been a mask of bored irritation, was now pale and utterly still. Her eyes were wide, sharp, and intensely focused on me, as if seeing me for the very first time. Kevin just stared, his mouth slightly agape, the dollar signs practically spinning in his eyes. My energy was gone. The rage that had fueled me sputtered out, leaving me dizzy and shaking. I had made a terrible, terrible mistake. I hadn't made them understand my sacrifice. I had just told them the price tag. I turned away, my legs feeling like water, and started for the stairs. I needed to lie down before I collapsed right there on the hardwood floor I'd refinished with my own 2 hands. Behind me I heard the first whispered words exchanged between them, urgent and electric, as the true weight of what I'd just revealed began to sink into their greedy minds. The urgent whispering stopped the instant my foot touched the bottom stair. It was so sudden, so complete, it was as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was heavy and watchful. I gripped the oak banister, my knuckles aching from the pressure, and forced myself to turn back and look at them. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. They were no longer sprawled on the couch in apathetic heaps. Both of them were sitting bolt upright, their postures alert, their bodies angled towards me. The medieval drama on the TV played on, forgotten, while a much older, much more primal drama began to unfold in my living room. "Dad, wait!" Kevin's voice had completely changed. Gone was the whiny irritation. replaced by a careful, measured tone, the one he used when he was about to ask for a loan. Maybe we were a bit harsh. If you're really feeling that bad, we should take it seriously. The concern in his voice was as thin as a coat of cheap paint, and I could see right through it to the greedy wallpaper underneath. Too little, too late. The numbers I had foolishly thrown out, $350,000 and $250,000, were now hanging in the air between us, shimmering like a heat haze, and they had changed everything. My sickness was no longer an inconvenience to them. It was an opportunity. Jessica had picked up the remote and muted the television. For the first time in what felt like months, I had her complete, undivided attention. She tucked her legs neatly under herself on the cushion, leaning forward with an expression of profound sincerity that she had somehow conjured from thin air. "Art, you know we care about you," she said, her voice soft and smooth as silk. "We're just so stressed about money lately, it makes us snappy. We're sorry." Stressed about money. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They lived in a paid-off house, ate food I bought, used electricity I paid for, and drove a car I maintained, and they were stressed about money. Meanwhile, I was the one who had worked until my back was permanently curved from leaning over engine blocks, until my hands were so callous they barely felt like my own. The fever made everything crystal clear, like looking through water that had suddenly settled. I could see the subtle shift in their body language, the way Kevin was nervously running his tongue over his lower lip, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a kid, right before he was about to lie about his report card. I saw the way Jessica's eyes had lost their bored, glassy look, and were now sharp, focused, and predatory. "How much exactly did you say was in the savings account?" Jessica's question was a masterclass in false nonchalance. She was trying to sound like a concerned family member doing an inventory of assets, but I'd been a mechanic long enough to know the sound of a stripped gear, and her voice was grinding with greed. "That's not your business, Jess," I started to say, but the words died in my throat. I was too weak for another fight. What was the point? The cat was out of the bag. The number was out there, and it was all they could see. 250,000, I repeated, my voice flat. I saw her do the math in her head, adding it to the value of the house. I could practically see the grand total flashing behind her eyes. $600,000. "And the house is assessed at 350? She pressed, no longer even bothering to hide her interest behind the veil of sympathy. The numbers felt like heavy, leaden weights in my mouth. They weren't just numbers. They were decades of my life. They were missed holidays, skipped vacations, aching muscles, and the constant smell of motor oil under my fingernails. They were my legacy, meant for the son who couldn't even be bothered to drive me to the pharmacy. The silence stretched between us again, thick with calculation. This wasn't about the flu anymore. This wasn't about a TV show. This was about my net worth. I had ceased to be a father, a provider, a man. I had become an obstacle, an aging, inconvenient obstacle standing between them and a comfortable future. Kevin cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "You know, Dad, maybe we should discuss this more when you're feeling better. Make some plans for the future. Plans for the future. My future, which in their minds was clearly a short-term problem with a very profitable solution." I watched Jessica nod enthusiastically, her eyes bright with an avarice that was far more terrifying than her earlier indifference. They were already spending it. In their minds, they were already picking out new furniture, planning vacations, paying off their debts with my life's work. The fever spiked again, sending a violent shiver down my spine. I had to get upstairs. I had to lie down before I collapsed. "Get your rest, Art," Jessica said, her voice dripping with that poisonous sweetness. "We'll talk about everything tomorrow, when you're feeling stronger. Tomorrow." When I'd be one day closer to the grave they were so clearly eager for me to fill. I gave a weak nod, not trusting myself to speak, and began the long, arduous climb up the stairs. Each step felt like lifting a cinder block. Behind me, I heard the distinct click of the television being turned off completely. For the first time in 3 years, they had chosen a family discussion over their entertainment. And the only thing that sickened me more than the flu was the realization that it took revealing my death benefits to finally get their full attention. I finally made it to my bedroom, closing the old wooden door behind me with a quiet click. The sound seemed to seal me off from the rest of the house, but I knew it was an illusion. Their presence, their greed, seeped through the floorboards from the living room below. I didn't even have the strength to get undressed. I just collapsed onto the bed, the old quilt my late wife, Helen, had made decades ago feeling heavy as a lead blanket. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed with angry red numbers. 8:07 p.m. It had only been an hour since I'd first asked for help, an hour that had managed to unravel 40 years of my life. The fever was climbing higher now. I could feel it in the way the room seemed to pulse with my own heartbeat, the floral pattern on the wallpaper gently warping and swimming in the dim light. I pulled the comforter up to my chin, but it did nothing to stop the deep, violent chills that racked my body. The sheets were already damp with a sick cold sweat, and I knew this was going to be a long, brutal night. At my age, a flu like this could easily spiral into pneumonia. The thought didn't bring self-pity, just a strange, cold clarity. I'd always known I wouldn't live forever. 68 years was more than some folks got. But lying there, burning up while the two people I should have been able to trust most in the world were downstairs, calculating my net worth, I realized I'd been a fool. An absolute blind fool. Memories, sharp as broken glass, crashed over me in feverish waves. I remembered Kevin at 18, standing in this very driveway as I handed him the keys to his first car. It was a 1995 Ford Escort that I'd bought for scrap and spent 3 months restoring with my own hands. I'd rebuilt the engine, replaced the transmission, and buffed the paint until it shone like a new penny. I remembered the look on his face, not gratitude, but a flicker of disappointment. "It's nice, Dad," he'd said, "but Tommy's dad got him a Mustang." That should have been my first clue, the first red flag. But I'd made excuses. He's just a kid, I'd told myself. He'll learn to appreciate hard work when he's older. He never did. The college bills came next. $80,000 over 4 years' money that could have been my retirement fund. Maybe that small cabin on Lake Erie I'd always dreamed of. Instead, I'd worked every overtime shift the plant offered. I remembered the ache in my shoulders that never went away, the taste of stale coffee on Saturday mornings, the sight of other families having barbecues in their backyards while I was under the hood of someone else's car. Also, Kevin could get his business degree and make something of himself. Except he didn't. That degree, that $80,000 piece of paper, was hanging in a frame on his bedroom wall downstairs, my bedroom wall, I guess, since he'd taken it over when he and Jessica moved in 3 years ago. Their wedding. That was the memory that truly twisted the knife. I'd refinanced this house, the house I'd finally paid off just 2 years prior, to give them a check for $25,000. I still remembered Jessica's shriek of delight when she saw the number. She'd thrown her arms around me, her cheek pressed against mine, and called me the best father-in-law in the world. The best father-in-law in the world. Right up until I needed a ride to the pharmacy while she was trying to watch television. I did the math in my fevered head, tallying up the costs. The college, the wedding, the car, the countless smaller loans, the 3 years of rent-free living. It had to be over $150,000. Maybe more. All of my life's work, handed over without a second thought, because I believed that's what a good father does. You provide. You sacrifice. My own father had died at 55, a heart attack from too many 14-hour days at the steel mill. He never saw retirement, never had a savings account to speak of. But he'd taught me the value of work, the importance of family. What would he think of me now, lying here burning with fever and resentment, while my son and his wife plotted their inheritance downstairs? Would he tell me I'd been too soft? Or would he understand the hole that gets carved in a man's chest when he realizes his sacrifices were seen not as gifts but as entitlements? My breathing was getting shallower, each inhale a painful, rattling effort. The medicine cabinet was empty. The pharmacy would close soon. And the two people who should have cared whether I lived or died were probably downstairs figuring out how to split my assets. And that's when the thought, so cold and clear and horrifying it seemed to cut right through the fever, struck me. It wasn't just that they didn't care if I got better. It was that they actively benefited if I didn't. My sickness, my potential death wasn't an inconvenience anymore. It was a solution, a profitable one. Why would they encourage me to see a doctor? Why rush to get me medicine? Every day I lived was just another day they had to wait for their payday. The clock on the nightstand now read 8:45 p.m. A long, dark night stretched ahead of me. But somewhere in the haze of sickness and betrayal, something else was taking root. Something harder than hurt and colder than my chills. They wanted me gone. They wanted my money. And I was lying in a bed, in a house they now controlled, completely at their mercy. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, adrift in a sea of fever and paranoia, the cold certainty of my situation pressing down on me. The house was silent, too silent. I imagined them downstairs, their heads bowed together over the coffee table, whispering, calculating, not with the frantic energy of a simple argument, but with the quiet, methodical focus of business partners drawing up a contract. A contract for which my life was the only outstanding clause. Then, my blood ran cold at a sound that should have been comforting. 3 soft, hesitant knocks on my bedroom door. The sound barely registered at first, just another phantom noise in my overheated brain. But it came again, a little more insistent this time, followed by Jessica's voice. A voice so completely transformed it was like listening to a stranger. "Art? Can I come in for a second? I brought you some water." Gone was the sharp, dismissive irritation. It had been replaced by a tone of such gentle, syrupy concern that the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was the voice of a predator luring a cornered animal out of its hiding place. I struggled to push myself up against the pillows, the simple movement sending a wave of dizziness through my skull and leaving me gasping for air. "Come in," I managed to croak, my throat raw. She entered the room slowly, closing the door behind her with an unusual, deliberate softness. She carried a glass of water, holding it out to me like a peace offering. As she approached the bed, I noticed she'd changed out of the comfortable sweats she'd been wearing all day. Now she was in jeans, a thick sweater, and sturdy-looking boots, as if she were preparing to go out into the cold November night. Her whole demeanor had shifted. She was no longer a lazy freeloader. She was a woman on a mission. "Art, I've been thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were right, and I was awful. It's the stress. It's no excuse. Your health is what's important. Let's go to the pharmacy." The words hung in the air between us, so completely unexpected I wondered if the fever was making me hallucinate. An hour ago, my potential death was an inconvenience. Now, it was a top priority. I blinked hard, trying to focus on her face in the soft lamplight. She looked different, more alert, her eyes clear and sharp. I knew exactly what had changed. It wasn't a sudden attack of conscience. It was the thought of $600,000. That was the magic number that could transform callous indifference into cloying concern. She moved to the edge of my bed and sat down, the mattress dipping under her weight. She reached out and placed the back of her hand against my forehead. Her touch was surprisingly cool against my burning skin, but the gesture felt hollow, practiced, almost clinical. It wasn't an act of comfort, it was an assessment. While her hand was on my head, I caught her eyes darting around the room, taking in the framed photos on my dresser, the heavy oak furniture I'd bought piece by piece, the small, locked jewelry box on Helen's nightstand. She was taking inventory. "You're burning up," she stated the obvious, pulling her hand away. "We need to get you some proper medication before this gets any worse." The urgency in her voice felt real, but I understood now that it had nothing to do with my well-being, and everything to do with protecting her potential investment. A dead man is worth his full inheritance. A man who recovers might just live long enough to change his will. "I'll help you get dressed," she continued, already moving towards my closet with a disturbing efficiency. "Kevin is still glued to that stupid show downstairs. He doesn't even know I'm up here." That last comment struck me as a jagged piece of glass in a bowl of sugar. Why would she lie? Why would it matter whether Kevin knew? Unless this was her plan, her initiative. A secret strategy she didn't want her weaker, more sentimental husband to interfere with. My mind was reeling, but what choice did I have? I was too sick to drive. I was too weak to wait until morning. And I desperately needed medicine if I was going to survive long enough to fight back. I had to walk into the trap to get the tools I needed to escape it. "I can manage," I said, the thought of her hands on me making my skin crawl. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and the room spun like a top. She steadied me with a firm hand on my shoulder, and I had to accept the support, even as every instinct screamed at me that I was leaning on my own executioner. As we moved towards the door, I caught a glimpse of us in the dresser mirror. A frail, sick old man, hunched over and trembling, being led into the night by a woman half his age, his arm draped over her shoulder in a grotesque parody of family affection. We were heading out for medicine, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the fever, that this trip was about something far more sinister than my health. The journey down the stairs was a descent into a special kind of hell. Each step sent a jarring shock through my aching knees, and I had to lean almost all of my weight on Jessica. Her grip on my arm was firm and steady, but it didn't feel supportive. It felt proprietary. It was the grip of a guard escorting a prisoner, ensuring I didn't stumble, not out of kindness, but to make sure the valuable asset made it to its destination intact. The air in the house was thick with unspoken things, and by the time we reached the front door, I was gasping, though I wasn't sure if it was from the effort or the suffocating tension. She helped me into the passenger seat of my own Ford F-150, my truck, the one I'd bought with my retirement bonus, the last vehicle I'd ever owned. She slid into the driver's seat and adjusted the mirrors and the seat, with a practiced efficiency that made my stomach churn. She'd been borrowing it for months, ever since Kevin's car had broken down for the third time. Seeing her so comfortable behind the wheel, in control of my property, felt like another small, humiliating surrender. She pulled out of the driveway into the cold, dark Parma night. A light, miserable drizzle had started to fall, the kind that never fully washes the world clean but just makes everything look grim and slick. The streetlights cast long, distorted halos on the wet asphalt, and the rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers began to sound like a countdown timer. For the first few blocks, the silence in the cab was absolute, broken only by the hum of the heater fighting off the autumn chill. I watched her out of the corner of my eye. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the steering wheel, and I noticed her checking the rearview mirror every 10 or 15 seconds, even though the streets behind us were nearly empty. What was she looking for? Or was she just so wound up in her own scheme that paranoia was taking over? Her nervous energy filled the small space between us, making the air feel thick and charged, and my own heart began to pound in a rhythm that matched the wipers. "So, how long have you been feeling this sick, Art?" she asked finally, her voice cutting through the mechanical sounds of the truck. The question seemed innocent, but coming from her, it felt like an interrogation. She wasn't asking about my well-being, she was establishing a timeline. "A few days," I mumbled, the words scratching my raw throat. "Started as a cold, got worse." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the road, but I saw her jaw tighten. "And you haven't taken anything for it, just aspirin?" Another fact, finding question. I just nodded, not trusting my voice. We turned onto Bagley Road, heading toward the town center. The familiar route, a drive I'd made thousands of times, felt alien and threatening tonight. Then, she changed tactics. "You know," she began, her voice taking on that same quality of false sincerity she'd used in the bedroom, "what you said earlier, about the house and the savings, it just got me thinking, about being prepared." She took a deep breath. "Is the will you made a few years ago, is that all made out to Kevin? To us?" The question hit me like a splash of ice water. There it was, the reconnaissance. I turned to look at her fully, trying to read her expression in the shifting, intermittent glow from passing street lamps. Her profile was set, determined, all traces of the concerned daughter-in-law completely gone. "Why would you ask something like that, Jess?" I kept my voice as neutral as I could, but my pulse was hammering against my ribs. "I'm not trying to be nosy," she said, shrugging, but the gesture was stiff and unnatural. "It's just, we've been living with you, helping you out. I just wondered if you'd made it official, helping me out." The delusion was so profound it was almost impressive. They hadn't helped me with a single thing. They had drained me. The drizzle was turning into a steady, cold rain now, drumming against the roof of the truck, amplifying the claustrophobia. We were alone, on dark streets, heading toward a pharmacy that would soon close. And the woman behind the wheel was methodically trying to confirm the details of her inheritance before I was even dead. When I didn't respond, she pushed again, her voice losing its gentle edge and taking on a sharper, more urgent tone. "Which bank holds the savings account, Art? I was just thinking, it would be good to know who to contact. For when we have to handle things. To make it easier. To handle things." The euphemism was so chilling, so blatant, that I felt the last of my strength drain away. She was asking for the roadmap to my life's work, so she could cash it in the moment I was gone. "Some things are private, Jess," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, and the silence that fell between us was no longer just tense. It was hostile. I could practically hear her mind racing, trying to figure out another angle, another way to get the information she wanted. Up ahead, the bright, sterile neon sign of Dave's Health Plus Pharmacy cut through the rain-soaked darkness. It should have been a beacon of relief, a promise of medicine, and a familiar face. But as Jess swung my truck into the parking lot, her cold, calculating questions still hanging in the air between us, I knew this wasn't an errand for my health. This was the final destination of a trap, and I was walking right into it. The transition from the dark, cramped cab of the truck to the vast, sterile brightness of the pharmacy was jarring. I squinted against the harsh, fluorescent glare as Jessica held the automatic door open for me, the sudden wave of warm, dry air instantly fogging my glasses. The place smelled of antiseptic cleaner and that faint, powdery scent of pills, a combination that should have been comforting but instead felt unnervingly clinical. At this hour, Health Plus was nearly deserted. A young mother, with a sleeping baby in a carrier, was quietly comparing bottles of cough syrup, and a teenager was buying a bag of chips from the front counter. The space felt hollow, echoing with the low hum of the refrigerated coolers and the soft, rhythmic beeping of a checkout scanner somewhere up front. As we approached the elevated pharmacy counter at the back of the store, a familiar face looked up from a computer screen. David Peterson. He'd been the head pharmacist here for as long as I could remember. At 55, he had the calm, competent air of a man who had seen everything. He'd filled prescriptions for my wife Helen's arthritis and Kevin's childhood ear infections. He was a landmark in my life, a point of stability in a world that was rapidly tilting off its axis. A small, unfamiliar feeling flickered in my chest, a tiny spark of hope. Art Morgan, for crying out loud, David said, his professional smile breaking into a genuinely warm one. Haven't seen you in a while. You look like you've been through the ringer. His observation was kind but direct, the trained eye of someone who could diagnose suffering from 20 feet away. For the first time all night, I felt seen. Not as an obstacle, not as a wallet, but as a person who was sick and needed help. Hey, Dave, I managed, my voice still a rough, gravelly version of itself. Got a bad case of whatever's going around. It's knocking me flat. David nodded sympathetically, already reaching for a consultation form. Let's see what we can do for you, buddy. Any allergies I need to remember? Still on the one blood pressure medication? I answered his questions as best I could, my fever-addled brain struggling to pull up details that should have been second nature. Through it all, Jessica stood beside me, a silent, rigid presence. I was acutely aware of her, standing just over my shoulder. She said nothing, but I could feel her watching every move, listening to every word. Her silence was more unnerving than her interrogation in the truck. It was the silence of a predator waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. I saw David give her a quick, polite glance, the kind you give to any family member, before turning his full attention back to me. All right, Art, he said after a few minutes, turning to the shelves behind him. I'm going to give you a strong course of antibiotics for that chest congestion, a prescription-strength fever reducer, and something to help you sleep through the night. That combination should knock this thing out in a few days. He worked with an efficient practiced grace, his hands moving surely as he counted out pills and printed labels. He placed the items into a crisp white paper bag with the pharmacy's logo on it. Total comes to $42.50, he said, placing the bag on the counter in front of me. $42.50. Such a small price for what felt like a lifeline. The spark of hope in my chest grew into a small flame. I was so close. Just pay the man, get the medicine, go home, and lock my bedroom door. I automatically reached for my back pocket, my fingers fumbling against the worn denim. Then I stopped. The familiar, reassuring lump of my leather wallet wasn't there. My heart sank with a sudden, sickening lurch. I patted my jacket pockets, my hands shaking with a new wave of frustration and illness. Nothing. I'm sorry, I said, the heat of embarrassment flushing my already feverish face. Dave, I think I left my wallet in my other jacket, in the truck. David's professional smile didn't falter, but I saw the flicker of concern in his eyes as he took in my pale face and the tremor in my hands. Jessica, meanwhile, had gone unnaturally still beside me, her gaze fixed intently on the bag of medication sitting on the counter. I'll be right back, I told them both, already turning away from the counter. Don't go anywhere. Just give me a minute. The short walk to the front of the store felt like a mile. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in a gust of cold, rain-soaked air that cut through my thin jacket. As I stepped out into the dark, empty parking lot, my mind was focused on one thing only: my own stupid mistake. I was completely oblivious to the fact that I had just created the perfect opportunity. I had left the sheep, the shepherd, and the wolf all alone in the pen together. The walk to the truck and back couldn't have taken more than 90 seconds. 90 seconds of fumbling with the car door in the cold rain, of grabbing my old worn leather wallet from the jacket I'd tossed on the passenger seat, of jogging awkwardly back towards the bright, welcoming doors of the pharmacy. It was nothing. A brief, frustrating interval. I found out later, from a shaking, horrified David, that 90 seconds was all she needed to try and end my life. The story he told me on the phone later that night is burned into my memory, every chilling detail present and accounted for. He said the moment the automatic doors slid shut behind me, Jessica's entire demeanor changed. The mask of the patient, concerned daughter-in-law dropped away, and she turned to him with a look of manufactured panic, her eyes wide, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of pure theater. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I completely forgot," she'd said, her voice a rushed, urgent whisper. "Art's allergic to penicillin, a really bad allergy. Hives, trouble breathing, the whole 9 yards. Is that what you put in the bag?" David, bless his sharp, methodical mind, didn't just take her word for it. He told me he felt an immediate prickle of suspicion. He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "That's strange," he'd said calmly, looking at my file. "I've been Art's pharmacist for nearly 20 years. There's not a single note in his entire history about a penicillin allergy." Jessica didn't miss a beat. "Well, the file's wrong then," she'd snapped, a sharp edge of frustration cutting through her performance. "It happened when he was younger. He hates talking about it. Look, please, you have to switch it. Just give him something else. Anything, we can't risk it." Her insistence was all wrong. It was too aggressive, too desperate. It wasn't the voice of a concerned relative. It was the voice of someone trying to force a cashier to accept an expired coupon. David knew something was off. He told me that in his gut he felt a cold dread, but his face remained a calm, professional mask. He made a decision then and there, a split-second choice that saved my life. He had to get away from the counter so he could see what she would do when she thought no one was watching. All right, calm down," he'd said to her soothingly. "Let me just step to the back for a moment. I need to check our inventory for a non-penicillin-based alternative." He stepped away from the main counter, but he didn't go to the inventory shelves. Instead, he moved just out of her line of sight, to a small desk where a monitor displayed the live feed from the security camera, pointed directly at the pharmacy pickup area, and he watched. On the grainy, black and white screen, he saw it all. He watched as Jessica, thinking she was finally alone, immediately dropped the panicked act. Her movements became sharp, efficient, and furtive. She glanced left, then right. Seeing the aisle was empty, she plunged her hand into her large leather purse. Her hand emerged, clutching a small, orange prescription bottle with the label conspicuously peeled off. With a speed that spoke of premeditation, she reached into the white paper bag on the counter, pulled out the bottle of antibiotics he had just prepared for me, and in one fluid motion, swapped it with the bottle from her purse. She shoved my actual medicine deep into her own bag, then neatly folded the top of the pharmacy bag back over, making it look completely undisturbed. The entire act took less than 10 seconds. David told me he felt the blood drain from his face. He was watching a cold, calculated crime. He didn't know what was in that bottle she'd just planted, but he knew it wasn't medicine. He'd seen enough drug-seeking behavior in his career to know when something was wrong, but this was different. This wasn't desperation. This was malice. His mind raced. He couldn't confront her, not without knowing what she was capable of, not without putting me in even more danger. He had to play along, but he also had to protect me. His professionalism took over. While her back was turned, he quickly and quietly grabbed a new white paper bag. He dispensed another full course of the correct antibiotics, the fever reducer, and the sleeping pills, creating a perfect duplicate of the original, untampered prescription. He tucked this second, safe bag under the counter, completely out of sight. He took a deep breath, smoothed the front of his pharmacist's coat, and walked back to the counter, his face a perfect mask of calm customer service. He had the evidence. He had the security footage. And now, he had a secret weapon. That was the scene I walked into, wallet finally in hand. I saw Jessica standing patiently by the counter, a soft, waiting smile on her face. I saw David behind the register, looking calm as ever. Everything appeared exactly as I had left it. I was completely, blissfully unaware that I had just missed my own attempted murder. I was the last person to know the truth, walking back into the heart of the ambush with the money to pay for my own execution. "Sorry about that, Dave," I said, my voice breathy as I finally made it back to the counter. I held up my wallet as proof of my success. "Found it. No problem at all, Art. Happens to the best of us," David replied, his voice a smooth, even professional calm. He gave me a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a tension in his shoulders I hadn't noticed before, a rigid stillness that seemed out of place. I figured it was just late and he was tired, eager to close up shop and go home. Jessica stood beside me, radiating a quiet impatience, her posture still as a statue. I slid my credit card across the counter, and David processed the payment with his usual efficiency. The machine beeped, the receipt printed, and the simple, mundane transaction was complete. "All right now," he said, sliding the white paper bag toward me, the same bag I'd seen him prepare just minutes earlier. "You'll want to take one of the antibiotics with food as soon as you get home. Then the fever reducer every 6 hours is needed. The other ones are just to help you sleep, so take one of those right before bed." "Oh?" It was the standard speech, the same instructions he'd given me a dozen times over the years for various ailments. But then, as I reached for the bag, he did something strange. He placed his hand lightly over mine, stopping me for a fraction of a second. His touch was brief, but his grip was surprisingly firm. I looked up from our hands to his face. He was looking me directly in the eye, his expression stripped of all professional pleasantry. His gaze was intense, urgent, and filled with a meaning I couldn't decipher. "You take care of yourself, Art," he said, his voice dropping low, almost a whisper. And then he added 2 words, emphasizing each one with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Really, care." Before I could process it, he released my hand and gave a slow, deliberate wink. Then, just as quickly, the professional mask was back in place. "Have a good night, folks." The moment was so brief, so jarring, that I almost convinced myself the fever had made me imagine it. But the feeling of his firm hand on mine and the piercing look in his eyes were real. A cold knot of dread formed in the pit of my stomach. What was that? A warning? A plea? I didn't have time to think. Jessica was already touching my elbow, gently but insistently steering me away from the counter. "Come on, Art," she said, her voice bright and overly cheerful. "Let's get you home so you can get that first dose in you. The sooner you start, the sooner you'll feel better." Her eagerness to get me to take the medicine, which should have been a comfort, now sounded sinister. It echoed strangely against David's cryptic message. We walked out into the cold, rainy night. The short trip back to the truck was a blur. The white paper bag in my hand felt strangely heavy, almost radioactive. I settled into the passenger seat, placing the bag carefully on my lap. As Jessica started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I looked back one last time at the pharmacy's bright windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see David standing behind his counter, watching us leave. He wasn't cleaning up or preparing to close. He was just standing there, a solitary figure under the fluorescent lights, watching my truck pull away into the darkness. The drive home was wrapped in a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than anything I had ever experienced. The rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers, the soft hum of the heater, they did nothing to fill the void. The air in the cab was thick with things unsaid. Jessica didn't try to make small talk. Her interrogation was apparently complete. She just drove, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, a faint, tight smile on her lips. She looked like someone who had just successfully completed a very stressful, very important business deal. I sat there, my mind racing, replaying the last 5 minutes over and over again. The transaction, David's words, the look in his eyes, the wink. "Take care of yourself, Art, really." It wasn't a casual farewell. It was a message. A clear, desperate signal that something was terribly wrong. I looked down at the bag on my lap. It was just a plain white paper bag, neatly folded at the top. But it didn't feel like medicine anymore. It felt like a threat. My gaze shifted to the woman beside me, her profile illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. Her calm, triumphant demeanor now seemed monstrous, Something had happened in the 90 seconds I was out of that store. Something David saw. Something that involved the bag of pills I was now clutching in my trembling hands. As we pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my own home offered no comfort. It looked like the end of the line. I was holding a package I'd been warned not to open, and I was about to be locked inside with the person who had handed it to me. The moment we walked through the front door, Jessica's campaign of false concern went into overdrive. Before I could even shrug off my damp jacket, she was herding me toward the kitchen, the tampered bag of medicine still clutched in her hand. "All right, let's get you a glass of water," she said, her voice buzzing with an unnerving energy. "The pharmacist said to take the first antibiotic as soon as possible. It's important to get it into your system." She was already at the sink, running the tap, her back to me. Her insistence was a blaring alarm bell in my head. David's intense gaze, his cryptic warning it all swirled together with the image of her eager, focused face. My body was screaming at me to lie down, but every instinct was screaming louder, telling me to run. I needed to get away from her. I needed space to think. I just need a minute," I stammered, leaning heavily against the wall. "My head is spinning. I've got to use the bathroom upstairs." It was the only excuse I could think of. Her face fell with a flicker of annoyance, so quick I would have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. It was replaced instantly with a mask of sympathy. "Of course, Art. Take your time. I'll leave the pills and water right here on the counter for you when you come down." She placed the white paper bag on the kitchen island with a soft, definitive rustle. I didn't answer. I just nodded, turned, and made my way back to the stairs, my legs trembling with more than just fever. This time, the climb felt different. It wasn't a retreat. It was a tactical withdrawal. I made it to my room and locked the door behind me, the click of the deadbolt sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I stared at the door, expecting to hear her footsteps following me, but there was nothing. I was alone. Safe for a moment. My old flip phone was on the nightstand where I'd left it. As my eyes fell on it, it vibrated, the buzz unnaturally loud in the quiet room. My blood ran cold. I flipped it open. A new text message from a number I didn't recognize. My hands shook as I read the words, each one a hammer blow. "Art, it's David from the pharmacy. Do not take the pills in that bag. Call this number when you are alone and it is safe. Urgent." The air left my lungs in a single ragged gasp. It was real. All of it. The dread, the suspicion, the cold certainty that I was in danger, it was all real. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the call button, holding the phone to my ear, my breathing shallow as I listened to it ring once, twice, before David picked up. "Art, thank God you called." His voice was a low, urgent whisper. "Are you alone? Can you talk?" "I'm in my room," I whispered back, my eyes darting toward the locked door. "The door's locked. What happened, Dave? What's going on?" "Listen to me very carefully, Art," he said, his voice steady and clear, a lifeline in a storm of fear. "I saw her. On the security camera. The second you walked out the door to get your wallet, she came back to the counter. She pulled a bottle out of her purse and swapped it with the antibiotics I had prepared for you. I don't know what's in that bottle, Art, but it is not your medicine." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had to sit down on the edge of my bed, the phone still pressed hard against my ear. A wave of nausea and grief washed over me. Jessica, the woman who ate at my table, who lived under my roof, who was married to my son. She had tried to poison me. The raw, personal nature of the betrayal was so profound, it almost stopped my heart. For a single, shattering moment, all I felt was a deep, desolate sorrow. But then, something else happened. The sorrow, the fear, the white-hot fever, it all seemed to burn away in a flash, consumed by a new, colder fire. The grief hardened, instantly crystallizing into something else. It was the mechanic in me, the part of my brain that doesn't panic when an engine seizes, but methodically starts diagnosing the problem. The sentimental old fool who had been mourning his family was gone. In his place was a man with a broken machine, and a very clear idea of how to fix it. "Do you still have it?" I asked, my voice no longer trembling. It was steady, cold. "Have what, Art?" "The footage, the security footage," I clarified. "It's saved to the system's hard drive. I made a backup copy before I left, and I kept the second bag, the real medicine. It's hidden safely at the pharmacy," David said. "Art, What are you going to do? I can call the police right now. No, I said instantly, a plan already forming in the cold, clear space in my mind. Not yet. She thinks I'm a weak, sick old man. She thinks I'm a fool. I'm going to let her keep thinking that. A fierce, dangerous resilience flooded my veins, pushing out the last of the fear. I hung up the phone. I walked to the dresser and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I saw a pale, trembling old man with fever-bright eyes and sweat-plastered hair. I looked like a victim. It was the perfect disguise. Downstairs, she was waiting for me to come down and take her poison. She thought this was the end of the story. She had no idea it was just the beginning. I was no longer a sick man, waiting to die. I was a strategist planning a war. And the first rule of war is to know your enemy and let them underestimate you at every turn. After I hung up the phone with David, I sat in the ringing silence of my room for a full minute, letting the new reality settle over me. The board was set, the pieces were in place. And for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly what my next move was. I unlocked my bedroom door, walked to the bathroom, and emptied the contents of the tampered pill bottle into the toilet. I watched the small, chalky tablets dissolve, a swirl of white in the clean water, before flushing them away into oblivion. It was a small act, but it felt like a declaration of war. Then, I went downstairs. Jessica was in the kitchen, wiping down the already spotless counter, a picture of domestic virtue. She looked up as I entered, her eyes immediately flicking to the empty water glass in my hand. A brief, satisfied smile touched her lips before she replaced it with a look of deep concern. You took it? Oh good, that's so good, Art. Now you just need to get some rest. I will, I said, my voice deliberately weak and raspy. I'm heading to bed. I placed the glass in the sink and shuffled past her, playing the part of the feeble, defeated old man she believed me to be. The next 3 days were a masterclass in deception. I stayed in my room, curtains drawn, feigning a worsening sickness. I'd let out a weak cough whenever I heard them approaching my door. They would bring me bowls of lukewarm soup and glasses of water, their faces etched with a perfect blend of feigned sympathy and barely concealed impatience. I could see the greed in their eyes, a hungry gleam that grew brighter each time I told them I felt weaker. They thought they were watching a man fade away. They had no idea they were watching a man get stronger. Getting the real medicine was the first logistical challenge. On the second day, I put the plan David and I had concocted into action. I called weekly from my room for Kevin. When he appeared, I told him the pharmacist had just called me, concerned about a potential printing error on the dosage instructions. He said he's sending a courier over with a corrected information sheet. I lied, my voice a pathetic croak. Could you just listen for the doorbell? An hour later, a man in a generic courier cap and jacket rang the bell. It was David. He handed Kevin a sealed manila envelope, said delivery for Mr. Morgan, and was gone before Kevin could get a good look at his face. Inside the envelope, tucked beneath a sheet of paper detailing standard antibiotic instructions, was a small, legitimate bottle of pills. My lifeline. With the real medicine secretly in my system, the fever finally broke on the third day. The fog in my mind lifted completely, leaving behind a cold, diamond-hard clarity. As my physical strength began to return, so did my resolve. The resentment and hurt I'd felt had been burned away, reforged into pure, unadulterated purpose. That afternoon I came downstairs, dressed in a clean shirt and jeans for the first time in days. I'm feeling a bit better, I announced to them. They were on the couch, of course. I think I just need to get out of the house, get some fresh air, run a quick errand. They exchanged a look, a flicker of surprise mixed with something else. Disappointment, maybe? But they couldn't object without revealing their ghoulish expectations. That's great, Dad, Kevin said, his enthusiasm ringing hollow. My errand wasn't to the hardware store or the bank. I drove downtown to a quiet brick building on a street lined with old oak trees, the law office of Thompson and Associates. The air inside smelled of leather, old paper, and quiet generational power. It was a world away from the emotional chaos and deceit of my own home. I was led into a conference room where a lawyer named Mr. Harrison, a man with kind eyes and a sharp suit, reviewed my file. Mr. Morgan, he said, looking up at me over his glasses, it says here you'd like to make some adjustments to your existing will. Not adjustments, Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice steady and clear, a voice they hadn't heard in my own house for years. A complete overhaul. I want to rewrite my legacy. For the next hour, I dictated the terms. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. My entire estate, the house, the truck, the tools in my garage, and every last cent of the $250,000 I had saved would be left in a trust. A trust dedicated to a single purpose: funding a scholarship program at the local community college for young men and women entering the skilled trades, with a specific focus on auto mechanics. It was perfect. My life's work wouldn't be squandered on entitlement. It would be used to build new lives, to give kids the start I never had, to foster the very value of hard work my own son had so thoroughly rejected. This will completely disinherit your son, Kevin Morgan, and his wife, Jessica Morgan, Mr. Harrison noted, his pen hovering over the paper. They will receive nothing. That's the point, I said. The moment he pushed the final, notarized documents across the mahogany table was the first time I had felt truly powerful in years. I signed my name, my hand steady, each letter a deliberate act of reclamation. As I walked out of that office and into the crisp autumn afternoon, the official document safely tucked in my jacket pocket, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lift from my shoulders. I had protected my past, and I had secured my future. Now, it was time to go home and deal with my present. I pulled my truck into the driveway at exactly 3:15 inches the afternoon. The sun, for the first time in days, had broken through the gray Cleveland overcast, casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat there for a moment, the engine off, the legal documents in my jacket pocket feeling as heavy and solid as a wrench. I looked at the house I'd worked my entire life to own. In a few hours, it would finally be mine again. The thought didn't bring a smile to my lips, just a quiet, profound sense of rightness. Justice was about to be served, not with shouting or violence, but with the cold, hard weight of the truth. I walked through my own front door. The familiar drone of the television filled the air, the soundtrack to their lazy, parasitic existence. Just as I expected, they were on the couch, Kevin staring blankly at the screen, Jessica scrolling through her phone. They looked up as I entered, and I saw a flicker of surprise in their eyes. I wasn't shuffling. I wasn't stooped over. I was standing tall. Without a word, I walked over to the television and pressed the power button. The screen went black, plunging the room into an abrupt, heavy silence. The sudden absence of noise was more jarring than a shout. "Dad, what's going on?" Kevin asked, blinking in confusion. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and carried a weight it hadn't held in years. It was the voice of the man who owned this house, and it commanded attention. I remained standing, looking down at them on the couch, a deliberate choice that shifted the balance of power in the room instantly. "I know what you did at the pharmacy, Jess," I began, my voice even and devoid of emotion. I watched as the color drained from her face, her casual posture instantly going rigid. "I know about the lie you told David, about a penicillin allergy I've never had. I know you thought he went to the back to check on inventory." Kevin looked from me to his wife, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. "What are you talking about? What lie?" I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on Jessica. Her mask was beginning to crack, a fine web of panic spreading across her features. "But David didn't go to the back, Jess. He went to a monitor where he could watch the security camera. He saw everything. He saw you pull a bottle from your purse. He saw you swap it with my antibiotics. My friend David saw you try to poison me." That's insane," Jessica stammered, but her voice was thin and reedy, all conviction gone. "Is it?" I continued, my tone like ice. "He has the footage saved, Jess. Pictures, clear as day, of you at the counter committing a felony." Kevin's head swiveled to stare at his wife, his face a canvas of dawning horror. "Jess? What is he talking about? Tell me he's wrong." She stared at me, her eyes wide with the terror of a cornered animal. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She couldn't deny it. She knew I had proof. "Why?" I asked, the single word hanging in the dead air of the room. "Was it the money? The $600,000? Is that what my life is worth to you?" That's when she finally broke. The facade of the calculating predator crumbled, and all that was left was a desperate, pathetic creature. "We were in debt," she sobbed, the truth spilling out like poison. $50,000 of debt. Credit cards, a personal loan. I didn't know what else to do. If you just died from the flu, it would have all gone away. All our problems would be solved. Uh, the casual, callous way she said it, "if you just died," sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had planned my murder with the same emotional logic someone uses to balance a checkbook. Kevin looked like he had been punched in the gut, staring at the woman beside him as if she were a complete stranger. And in that moment, she was. "There's just one problem with your plan," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket. My hand emerged, not with a weapon, but with a folded set of legal documents. I tossed them onto the coffee table in front of them. "You were trying to kill me for an inheritance that no longer exists." Kevin's eyes darted down to the papers, his face a mask of disbelief. Jessica just stared, her sobs catching in her throat. "I just came from my lawyer's office," I explained calmly. "As of an hour ago, this house, my savings, my truck, every last penny to my name, is being left to a charitable trust. It will fund a scholarship for underprivileged kids who want to learn a trade. Kids who want to become mechanics. Kids who actually understand the value of hard work." The silence that followed was absolute, the most profound silence I had ever heard. It was the sound of a future crumbling to dust. It was the sound of greed choking on its own consequences. Kevin picked up the papers with a trembling hand, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, the finality of my signature at the bottom. Jessica made a small, wounded sound, a gasp of pure, animal despair. She hadn't just failed to get the money, she had been the direct cause of it vanishing forever. I let them sit with the ruins of their scheme for a long moment before delivering the final judgment. "You have 48 hours, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Pack your bags. Pack everything that belongs to you. I want you out of my house, out of my life, and I never want to see either of you again." Kevin opened his mouth to protest, to beg, then closed it again. What could he say? What defense could he possibly offer? He had made his choice when he had enabled her, when he had ignored his own father's suffering. I turned my back on them then, on their tears and their shattered future. I walked into my kitchen, leaving them sitting in the wreckage. The reckoning was over. The verdict had been delivered, and I had never felt more at peace. I didn't stay in the kitchen. I didn't need to hear their whispers or watch their world collapse. I had delivered the judgment. Sitting around for the aftermath felt unnecessary. I went out to my garage, my true sanctuary, and spent the rest of the afternoon just tinkering, the familiar feel of a wrench in my hand more comforting than any words could be. I could hear the muted sounds of their frantic packing through the walls, a chaotic symphony of drawers slamming, boxes being dragged across the floor, and the occasional muffled sob from Kevin. They didn't try to speak to me again. The time for words, for lies and excuses was over. The next day, they moved like ghosts through the house they had once dominated. The television was silent. They worked with a grim, desperate efficiency, stuffing 3 years of their life into cardboard boxes and black garbage bags. Kevin's face was a hollow mask of shame. He avoided my eyes, his shoulders slumped in permanent defeat. Once, as he carried a box of his old college textbooks past me, the very books I'd paid for, he opened his mouth as if to speak. An apology, maybe. A justification. But the words wouldn't come. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek, and continued on. There was nothing left to say. Jessica was another story. Her tears had dried up overnight, leaving behind something cold and hard. There was no remorse in her eyes, only the flat reptilian anger of a predator whose prey had unexpectedly fought back. She packed with a methodical fury, her movements sharp and precise. She wasn't mourning a family, she was liquidating a failed investment. I knew then that she would survive. People like her always do. They just find another host, another life to feed on. But it wouldn't be mine. On the final evening, exactly 48 hours after I had passed my sentence, the rain started again, a cold, steady downpour that matched the mood perfectly. I stood at my living room window, a cup of hot coffee warming my hands, and watched them load the last of their pathetic belongings into Kevin's car. It wasn't much to show for 3 years of living. A few suitcases, a handful of boxes, a collection of things that had never truly been theirs. Kevin paused before getting into the driver's seat, his hand on the car door. He looked back at the house one last time, his gaze lingering on the porch where he'd learned to ride his bike, the window of the bedroom where I'd read him bedtime stories. It was a look of profound, bottomless loss. Not for me, I knew, but for the easy, comfortable life he had so carelessly thrown away. "Goodbye, Dad," he said, his voice so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the sound of the rain. I could see the words form on the glass of the window, a small puff of condensation in the cold night air. Jessica didn't look back. She was already in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead into the darkness, already plotting her next move, her next life. I didn't move from the window. I just watched as the car backed out of my driveway, its red taillights bleeding into the wet, black asphalt of the street. I watched until they turned the corner at the end of the block and disappeared from my life forever. And then there was peace. The house was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of the past few days. It was a clean silence, a whole silence. The air itself felt lighter, as if the very walls had exhaled a breath they'd been holding for 3 long years. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the back of my leather couch. My couch. I stood in the center of the living room and listened to the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the sound of my life returning to its proper rhythm. For the first time in so long, the loneliness didn't feel like a wound. It felt like freedom. I sank into my armchair, the worn fabric molding to my back like an old friend. The anger, the resentment, the cold fury, it was all gone. It had served its purpose, and now it had left, leaving behind only a deep, quiet calm. I thought about the future. Not about them, but about the young men and women who would one day learn a trade because of the choices I had made. My legacy was no longer a house and a bank account waiting to be claimed. It was a gift, freely given to those who would earn it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would call a travel agent. That little cabin on Lake Erie was sounding better than ever. I was 68 years old, and I had just learned the hardest and most important lesson of my life. You can't control who your family is, but you can, and you must, control who has the power to break your peace. And in my house, in my life, that would only ever be me.